Greetings to all colleagues attending the Global Governance Summit under the theme Re-Engineering Governance for Good. What a privilege it is for me to talk to you about good governance reset, the role of civil society. The intention of my presentation is to discuss the role of civil society in two ways. Firstly, how does civil society deal with its own governance challenges? But secondly, how does civil society become a force for good in addressing the governance challenges within the state and within the corporate world, and even in global governance organizations such as the AU, UN, SADC, etc. You will agree with me that we've found ourselves in a context where many of our people are complaining, who moved my cheese? That's the title of a book by Spencer Johnson, where a colony of two people and mice found themselves without cheese that they had relied on. They didn't know who put the cheese there, but one day the cheese was gone. And the people started complaining about who moved their cheese, whilst the mice moved forward to find their cheese. And the moral of that story is often it doesn't help you to ask who made the mess. What helps is to ask the question, what can be done and what will I do? If you think about our time when it comes to issues of good governance, we are in the middle of scandals and a declining moral high ground for civil society organizations. There's the Me Too movement, for example, that hit Hollywood, but some of those scandals around sexual harassment have found their way into powerful civil society organizations. And you'll agree with me that if you are seen as a beacon of hope, if you're seen as the voice of morality, you are held to much higher standards because you're expected to lead by example. When I was a kid, there was a story of a crab that was admonishing his child to walk straight. And the little child said, "But mommy, you too walk in a crooked way." And that's what happens to organizations in civil society, the judiciary, in Chapter 9 institutions. It is expected that those who watch others should do better than those that they watch. And the third thing with civil society is that some of these scandals have also impacted on the fundability of our organizations. As we face the COVID-19 calamity, those with money think far more seriously about where to put that money. And obviously they want to put that money where there's proper governance, where the money is going to be used optimally. And that's where the challenge is. One of the things that bothers me about our role as civil society is making an impact. Let's look at South Africa, for example. Youth unemployment at 70%, poverty at 55.5% across groups, and among Africans like me, it's 64.2%, and in some of the provinces like the Eastern Cape, it higher than 70%. So we're talking about hope disrupted in a country with a constitution that is seen by the whole world as a groundbreaking constitution, a constitution that at some stage was held high by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg to Egyptians and said, this is the constitution to look up to. So what has gone wrong? I will say to you, Rome did not fall in one day. What has happened is that civil society, like the rest of our society, has allowed certain tendencies to just keep growing. Ethical governance lapses, leadership lapses, and then just pure governance lapses. Where is the playbook for how should civil society be governed? I would say if you're in South Africa, you've got to look to the Constitution. Even though the Constitution sets the parameters for how the state should function, but as civil society, we're part of that society, and therefore it's important that what we do contributes to the society that is dreamt of in the Constitution. For example, in the South African Constitution, the Constitution says that it is the blueprint for healing the divisions of the past and establishing a society that is based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. And our Constitutional Court has said this is a transformative constitution. And some people, of course, reduce transformative constitutionalism to administrative law and accountability. But cases such as S versus Mokwenyane, cases such as Daniels versus Gribante, and Minister of Finance versus Van Heerden remind us that the greatest transformative injunction in that constitution is the injunction about creating an egalitarian society. In other words, disrupting the patterns of inequality from the past. So if you are part of the NGO community, it is our job to help our society and to contribute to building this society of our dreams. In part, the preambles, for example, says that we, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of our past, believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. We therefore, through our freely elected representatives, adopt this constitution as the supreme law of the Republic so as to heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. It further states basic entitlements of citizens and others, and these include as basic things such as food, water, and social security or social assistance. It also includes an equality duty in section 9.2 that says equality includes equal enjoyment of all rights and freedoms, and cemented with a duty in section 7.2 that says it is the duty of the state to make sure that these human rights are real, and that includes the human right to equality. And section 237 enjoins the state to prioritize constitutional responsibilities and pursue them diligently. So as NGOs, this is the framework. How is it that we're part of these kinds of societies, our society in South Africa and the global community? We're part of these societies that have not moved towards egalitarianism, despite the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, despite the African Charter for Human and People's Rights, and similar documents in Europe. Although I must say, there are countries that I think are doing better. The UK and the European Union is doing better in terms of pursuing the equality duty. Lastly, there are structures that are created in the Constitution, a polycentric accountability framework and a polycentric governance framework, which is different structures. Key among these structures are new institutions that were introduced, such as the Public Protector and the Constitutional Court, to ensure that there is more leeway, there's more opportunities for people to exact accountability when their rights have been violated or when there's governance failure. The Constitution also includes provisions that deal with the character of the state, which you'll find in section 96 on ethics, 136, 195, highest professional ethics, and the duty to be responsive to everyone, and section 237, which is to prioritize. Lastly, if the Constitution gives us a broad framework for governance, where do we get specific guidelines on what applies to us as the NGO sector? I would say the UN principles on good governance are the best way to look, and the UN elaborates 8 principles on good governance, and these are accountable, number 1, 2, transparent, 3, responsive, 4, equitable and inclusive, 5, effective and efficient, 6, follows the rule of law, 7, participatory, and 8, consensus oriented. These principles are important even if you're running an NGO. it becomes important. Accountability is the most important principle. But accountability is not enough when the services you're delivering are not equitable and they're not responsive to the community that you claim that your organization is serving. And then transparency is extremely important because sunshine is the best of disinfectants. You also require to be effective and efficient, follow the rule of law, and be participatory as NGOs. Participatory within the team in the NGO and participatory in terms of the people who you serve and the stakeholders who invest in you. And consensus oriented is extremely important for the promotion of peace. What can we do though, given where we are now, to rebuild better? I personally think that we have a great opportunity for resetting things, and not just resetting the economy, but resetting the way we govern our NGOs, the way we govern the corporate world and government. But we as an NGOs also have an opportunity to help government and the corporate world to reset the way they do things. Because as NGOs, we have an opportunity to research. We also have an opportunity to interact with the people more closely and more intensely. At Stellenbosch University, this has translated in us coming up with the Social Justice M Plan, which is primarily looking at advancing social justice, copied in part from the post-Second World War II Marshall Plan that sought to help Europe to rebuild itself. Because we know that even with good intentions, even without state capture and without corruption, government can't do everything it can do. It cannot fix all of the problems. And the Social Justice M Plan has 4 dimensions. One is social justice conscious policies and laws. The second one is social accountability and social cohesion. The fourth is resource mobilization. And the fourth one is attuned leadership and a capable state. So that's just at the level of social justice. I have indicated to you why social justice is important. It's important because if you're trying to get people to do the right thing, people tend not to do the right thing if they have grievances. I think it's the Max Planck Institute that did an example with monkeys who were asked to do a particular task, but the reward system was uneven. The one monkey was being given grapes, the other one was being given cucumbers, which was perceived by the monkey as unfair. And then the monkey that perceived itself to be being treated unfairly started not working. So from a governance point of view, social justice becomes important because in the absence of social justice, we face social conflict, but also we cannot have a functional economy when people are feeling that the rewards of hard work are not accessible. Because as long as there's injustice somewhere, democracy and peace cannot be sustained. And there are 6 strategic impact areas that I think me, you, and everyone in the civil society space can prioritize. The first one is we need to help government to align law and policies with the vision of the society we want to build, particularly when it comes to ethics. We could include having a transversal ethical code. And you know that ethics are at the core of good governance. We can have all of these 8 pillars of good governance, but if people don't do the right thing, if people don't behave in a principled way, then everyone will need to be shepherded every minute of the day. The second thing is lead by example. Civil society, as I indicated, started as having the moral high ground. People respond much better to what you do than what you say. So it's going to be important that as civil society we lead by example to foster a culture of ethical leadership and governance. We lead by example in our own organizations. We lead by example in society. I mean, at Tuma we regard leadership as the art of influencing and inspiring yourself and others to think and act in a desired way. And we even suggest a particular brand of leadership, which is leadership that is ethical, that is principled leadership, purpose-driven, impact conscious and committed to serve everyone. Because if you leave anyone behind, then your leadership is part of problems in society rather than being the solution. The third is leverage 4IR solutions to improve systems. Here I'm talking about governance systems with a focus on transparency and consistency. I've seen here at Stellenbosch University that with using technology, there's certain things that people can't do if the technology says you must complete this field first before you can move forward. And right now we're doing a study there in Swartland. The ethical requirement was such that we should complete certain fields in our request to conduct this research. And when we hadn't complied with certain ethical requirements, the system would not accept our application to be given permission to move forward. So you can use 4IR technologies to improve governance in your NGO, and also in government. And we as NGO people can also assist government to leverage these technologies to do better in governance. Fourthly, end impunity by ensuring consistent and speedy accountability at all levels, particularly on matters of corruption, capture, and ethics. And this is important in NGOs. A lot of NGOs, when it comes to governance challenges, being the processes and procedures of decision making and decision implementation, they've been caught napping when it comes to speedy response to allegations of impropriety, especially when those accused of impropriety are at the level of leadership. We've seen scandals involving sexual harassment in this country and globally as part of the Me Too movement, including organizations that are institutions of the United Nations. So it becomes extremely important to move fast. Firstly, if you move fast, you restore trust. But secondly, you likely also to make sure that you get the information on time and you nip that impropriety in the bud. Fifthly, collaborate in the sector and between state, business, and society to reinforce social accountability. If we empower people to know what's happening, where to ask questions, to whom to ask questions, then we leverage them as their own eyes and ears. We get to know what's going wrong faster because the people are watching and they're empowered to point out wrongdoing. Lastly, ensure visible progress on social justice, and this is an issue that I cannot overestimate. If we don't make progress on social justice, we won't make progress on corruption, because a lot of people depend then on corruption to get into the middle class and to get into wealth. If we don't deal, for example, with historical imbalances, it becomes difficult to end corruption because people think they're justified because the system is already rigged against them. And I do think a lot of the corruption that we're experiencing and a lot of the pushback we are seeing against the State Capture Commission in South Africa has to do with disrupted patronage lifelines. My speech seems to suggest that things are all bad when it comes to civil society. It is not so. I see a lot of hope. There is a glimmer of hope. And firstly, the COVID-19 and the rise in extremism in the world gives us a reset opportunity. Failure can be a great teacher and cultivator of wisdom. And the COVID-19 calamity is a great opportunity for resetting various anchors of peaceful human coexistence and progress, including good governance. And encouraging development in this regard is greater collaboration between state, business, and society. This event itself is part of the glimmers of hope that show that we understand where we are lacking and we are resetting for rebuilding better together. Because Ethiopians say when spider webs combine, they can tie up a lion. And as we move forward with a view to ensuring that this world does better, particularly leveraging the Sustainable Development Goals, good governance will be a good way to anchor everything. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I trust we're all keeping well and safe in these interesting times. I would like to start by thanking the organizers for putting this wonderful event together. Thank you very much also for inviting me. We can never talk too much about corporate governance. Today, I'm going to be speaking on governance and the corporate sector. Corporate governance is under the spotlight all over the world like never before. The corporate sector particularly is operating in a VUCA world, a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, which makes the effectiveness of their corporate governance very critical. These volatilities contributing to the constant changes in the business environment include the recent COVID-19 pandemic, technology disruptions, adoption of new or non-traditional business model by new entrants, rates and quantum of passing new regulations by the regulators, and changing expectations of a more aware stakeholder group. All these have caused businesses to experience hard times. Major corporate governance failures such as Enron, WorldCom, and so on that we've seen in the past, and other examples that we continue to see even in our world today, both locally here in Africa as well as globally, have revealed some common traceable root causes for these failures. These include 1, domineering parties and personalities within or outside the board, inadequate board composition and diversity, poor risk management practices, weak regulatory compliance culture and processes, weak internal control systems, weak ethics and culture leading to abuse of power, ineffective board structures and practices. These are indeed worrisome, and a number of governments and key stakeholders have come together over the years to put more structures and regulations in place following the rise in these global corporate failures. These include the numerous codes of corporate governance issued by countries such as the UK Code of Corporate Governance, the King IV Code of Corporate Governance in South Africa, as well as other regulations brought together by the OECD and of course IFC being a major stakeholder in a number of corporates. Nigeria is also not left out in all of this, and permit me to just focus a little on the local trends in Nigeria. Prior to the emergence of the first governance code issued by the Securities and Exchange Commission in Nigeria in 2003, most organizations in Nigeria relied on the provisions of the Company and Allied Matters Act, as well as other general and industry-specific regulations to run their businesses, and I imagine this is the same as all over the world. But it was clear that these didn't really fully focus on corporate governance matters, and then corporate challenges within sectors brought to the forefront key corporate governance issues that needed to be covered by specific legislations, especially because a number of these large companies were not listed on the stock exchange as at that time. Following this, sectorial regulators developed individual sector codes of corporate governance to cater for their own sectors, including the banks, insurance companies, pension companies, and telecommunications companies operating in Nigeria who were not listed on the stock exchange at that point in time. Most recently, the Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria, in conjunction with all other regulators and private sector individuals, came together to develop and issue a Nigerian Code of Corporate Governance in January 2019. I was a member of that committee, and KPMG acted as the technical secretariat for that committee. The objective of the code was to help standardize corporate governance in Nigeria for companies all across sectors, including companies that were not previously covered by the SEC code. The significant provisions within this code in Nigeria, which I know exist in a number of other codes outside Nigeria, is for companies to carry out an annual corporate governance evaluation and also a board evaluation, as well as report on the level of compliance with the code provisions. And these requirements have significantly shaped the corporate governance landscape in the corporate sectors. To a large extent, the corporate sector has relied on the provisions within these codes of corporate governance in developing their governance framework, while focusing on the key principles that drive good corporate governance. I will briefly share my perspectives on some of these challenges faced by companies in embedding these governance principles within their organizations. The first being the issue of independence. Domineering individuals and personalities in and outside the board have been one of the leading causes of governance failures, as I mentioned earlier. Also, the occurrence of groupthink on boards, promoted by lack of diverse experience and skills, as well as lack of tenure limits, have also hindered the ability of boards to constructively challenge management proposals and make informed decisions. Independence also gets eroded when directors are overpaid or given performance-based pay. To address these challenges, more independent non-executive directors should be appointed on boards to help ensure that unbiased opinions can be heard during deliberations. Additionally, every director, whether classified as an independent or not, is expected to bring a degree of independent mindset to discussions while ensuring that their independence is not impaired through short-termism or other personal gains. Lastly, creating an environment where people are able to express their opinions is very critical. The second area is in the area of openness and transparency. Stakeholders often complain of delayed and inaccurate information on company operations, which prevent them from making informed decisions. Timely and accurate communication with stakeholders has proven to be very important, and this became even more important during the COVID-19 pandemic. Companies that had implemented good communication strategies for their stakeholders, including customers, regulators, shareholders, and have managed to maintain the stakeholders' trust during the pandemic, and this helps to improve even the valuation of such companies. We've also seen recent trends on influential investors putting pressure on companies to do the right thing, and this will continue even into the future. The third area is accountability. The board of directors are jointly and individually accountable for decisions made for the company. There have been cases or situations where companies cease to be going concerns because of wrong decisions made by the board of directors, and sometimes they are never brought to account for their actions. Good systems of internal control, internal and external audit, and risk management frameworks provide relevant checks and balances needed to promote transparency and improve the quality of decisions made by the board and its directors. The fourth and last area is the area of integrity. The tone at the top in any company is defined by the board of directors and management. We've seen lots of failure in this area, including insider trading issues, personal conflicts eroding good judgments on boards, mismanagement of related party transactions as well. Setting the right tone at the top by consistently communicating the appropriate culture and ethical requirements across the organization ensures that members of staff and the board are aware of behaviors that are deemed acceptable. This could be achieved through attestation to codes of conduct by directors and employees, deployment of an ethics line that guarantees anonymity, and actually sanctioning individuals that have been found culpable. These are indeed things that need to be embraced more in corporates. In conclusion, ensuring continued improvement in corporate governance landscape in the corporate sector requires collective effort from many key stakeholders, including the government, regulators, industry leaders, board of directors, senior management, and staff at large. in order to be able to move beyond a tick-the-box exercise to a level where corporate governance is embedded across various levels of the company. Some good practices that will ensure that governance is preserved include: 1, having the right people on the board, and this starts from the appointment process. When companies utilize a transparent and formal process to identify the skills, the competencies, and attributes and diversity required on the board, this would help to ensure the right people are appointed to the boards. The second one is looking at developing and implementing a corporate governance framework, which includes the applicable charters and terms of reference for the board, its committees and management committees, governance policies, delegation of authority framework, and so on. All of these will help to standardize activities and ensure good practices in companies. The third area is increasing the shareholders and other stakeholders' engagement and awareness of their rights and power to influence and shape compliance with good corporate governance and sustainable practices in corporations. We also need to ensure proactive enforcement of regulation, including incentives to encourage compliance with national codes of corporate governance. This needs to be adopted by the regulators. Lastly, continuous corporate governance training and development for corporate sector leaders should be embraced. This is aimed at ensuring that sitting and prospective directors are armed with the knowledge of corporate governance that they need to lead organizations sustainably and achieve their corporate objectives. And this awareness and training should start even from when people are in universities. When we catch them young and begin to inculcate the right culture and tone, even within the students that will end up becoming the leaders of tomorrow, we find out that we have better corporate governance culture within our organizations. The future of corporate governance in corporate sectors should aim towards building the right governance systems that would allow companies stay ahead and respond promptly to the changes in their business environment and guarantee their long-term sustainability. Thank you very much.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you are in the world. I'm Seamus Gillen. I'm the founder director of Value Alpha Limited. I've been asked to produce this keynote presentation because for the past 10 years, I've been working pretty intensively around the world, working with boards and directors to help them improve their governance and help them improve the success of their organization, their organizational outcomes. I've done a lot of work in terms of writing regulatory guidance here in the UK, where I'm based, and I've also written governance codes from around the world. And next year I'll be publishing a book called Building Better Boards, being published by Bloomsbury, which seeks to bring together all the experience I've had over the past 10 years on what it takes to build a better board, for boards to become more effective. What I wanted to talk about is the governance journey, and there's one key point I want to make in this conversation. But let me begin by saying that governance up till now has, in my view, had two real existences. The first, for most of its lifetime, has been one where governance has been seen as a compliance exercise, something we have to do, an area of subject matter expertise, but in the back room, a cost, an overhead, something that actually can get in the way of business. But actually, increasingly, recently, maybe over the past 5 years and increasingly intensely, governance is being seen as a business critical discipline, a fundamental underpin to the way in which organizations run themselves, and particularly where they're operating in a capitalist system. It offers the the prospect of competitive advantage. And the clever boards around the world now put governance front and center of everything that they do. And the big point I want to make in this very short keynote presentation is that we now need to move boards on again, from being compliance initially through to being a business enabler, and finally now to being a driver of transformational change. And that is what this whole session that we're getting involved in today is about, driving transformational change in governance. It's important to say that boards are the main form of governance system around in the world. We live in a capitalist world, and in that world, the board model of governance is the dominant model, is pretty much the only model. And as Mervyn King, who is somebody we all know and respect, has often pointed out, an organizational entity is inarticulate, it's incapacitated, it doesn't move, it doesn't achieve anything by itself. It's the board of directors who give the entity its personality and its character. It's the board of directors which is expected to show the leadership to take the organization forward. The organization won't achieve anything on its own. It's the board of directors which shows the leadership which takes the organization forward. And so in the world that we're now facing, where we need transformational change in society, it's the board of directors which needs to be capable of showing that leadership to drive that organizational change. So what I'm saying is it's the board which is has to show the leadership and the personality and the character to bring the organization to life. So if we're talking about revolutionary governance, transformational governance, rather than incremental evolutionary governance, we need to understand what's going on around us. And one way of looking at this is to look at the world and to understand that because we live in a world of capitalism, capital can move anywhere, anytime it likes. Capital can cross boundaries, it can move into jurisdictions to seek out opportunities at its own will. And capital does this all around the world. And when capital moves around the world, it is then followed by regulation, and is followed by governance. And sometimes governance comes first, sometimes regulation comes first. They move at different speeds, they take different forms. But everywhere in the world, we see capital moving. And we see regulation moving around the world, regulators talking to each other and moving around the world, following that capital and regulating that capital. And we see governance systems being put into place within which that capital and that regulation operates. So when we think about capital, we tend to think about financial capital. And as we now know, we need to start thinking about capital differently. And I want to share a few slides with you just to show that this will be a very familiar slide to you from the International Integrated Reporting Council, which shows the different forms of capital. And this is the future of capitalism. This is the future of the organization. This is the future of the company. We can't simply think about capital in terms of financial capital. We also need to think about manufactured capital, intellectual capital, human, social, and natural capital. This is the world towards which we're moving. And this is the world that we need governance to oversee and boards to understand. And the world is changing very quickly. And the agenda that we are now addressing is the need to understand the impact of our organizations on the world around us. And we can do this by reference to this very important model of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So no longer can we live in the 20th century, which was a century of unsustainable development. We now know that we are living in the 21st century, and this has got to be a century of sustainable development. So the 6 capitals tell us that we need to look at capital moving around the world in a different kind of way, and we need to reference that capital moving around the world by thinking about sustainability, sustainable development goals. If we don't do that, then the future is looking bleak. So this is the transformational governance model that we need to begin to embrace. And one of the reasons we say that is there's no hiding place now for organizations anymore. There used to be in the past, you could do things and get away with things, but we're now living in a world of total transparency. It's like a goldfish bowl. Everybody can see us, everybody knows what we're doing. And we need boards to be able to understand that they are operating in this world of transparency and accountability, and begin to work with stakeholders in terms of delivering the kind of future that Generation Z, Generation Z, the millennials want in terms of the world going forward. We know this is a graphic from the World Economic Forum and the Davos summits. We know that the world is traveling at an incredible speed. Innovation is happening in terms of artificial intelligence, cyber, physical systems are talking to each other, computers are talking to each other, and the half-lives of economic development are getting shorter and shorter all the time. The point I want to make is this, that we are now facing a new generation of change, which is even going to put the 4th generation of cyber systems, of artificial intelligence, the cloud, blockchain, and all of these systems into one of relative insignificance compared to what I would call the 5th industrial revolution, or potentially the 3rd World War. And this is the challenge of climate change. In October and November this year in Glasgow, in the UK, we have the 26th Conference of the Parties, and it is the last opportunity we have to do something about climate change. We have, as President Joe Biden said, 1 more year left before irreversible change happens. And we have seen this with the fires in the US, the fires in Europe, the flooding in China, the flooding in Europe. We have already seen in 2021 the irreversible change which is already beginning to happen. So we have one last opportunity this year and next year to stop the harmful, disastrous effects of climate change. And after that, we have to move from a strategy of stopping climate change to one of managing the catastrophic crises which are going to be with us in the years to come. So this is the 5th industrial revolution, and the change which is needed in our world to counter the effects, to counter the impacts of climate change are going to require transformational change in the way in which we run our organizations, our companies, our parastatal bodies, our public sector bodies, our not-for-profits, whichever organizations we're part of. We are going to have to face up to these consequences, and we are going to have to change the way in which we operate and the way in which we run ourselves as organizations. And this is going to require a degree of transformational change in our governance systems. And because boards are at the center of the governance ecosystem, that means that boards are going to have to take the lead, have to show the leadership in governance, in promoting the transformational governance that will allow us to address this issue. So we're asking boards to lead a transformational agenda of governance, which is like nothing that we have seen before. What does that look like? What do boards need to do? What does this transformational governance, this third generation of governance? First of all, we had the compliance approach to governance. Then more recently, we have seen governance as a liberating theology, governance as a business enabler, a facilitator of the best possible decision-making to allow our organizations to be successful. This third generation of governance, this transformational, revolutionary governance that we now need to embrace, what does this look like? Well, first of all, we need boards which completely change their composition. We need boards which are genuinely different in perspective inside the boardroom, cognitively diverse, diverse in terms of gender, ethnicity, other kinds of orientation, but most of all, cognitively diverse. Different ways of thinking inside the boardroom, boards which are capable of seeing this new future emerging and which are capable of taking decisions that position and reposition their organization in the world that lies ahead. We need boards to really up the game in terms of their accountability to their stakeholders, to understand who their stakeholders are, what the expectations of those stakeholders are, and how the organization can meet those legitimate expectations of those stakeholders. So this is calling for levels of understanding of those stakeholders and accountability to those stakeholders, which is like nothing that we've seen before. That requires very strong leadership from the board to do what Mervyn King has asked, that we take these inert, inarticulate entities and use them as platforms to drive this organizational change. We need boards to think about their reputational positioning with their stakeholders and their brand positioning in the markets in which they operate. We need these boards to execute their business model even more effectively than they have in the past, to manage the risks to that execution of their strategy, to make sure that their control regimes are in place so that the value which is created under this new way of thinking is protected, is preserved. And most of all, we need boards to take seriously this whole area of purpose, the vision, the mission, the values, the culture, and the behaviors. It's what we call the soft stuff, but there is nothing soft about this. And we need boards to realize that the hard stuff is the soft stuff, because unless these boards concentrate on the soft stuff, the vision, the mission, the values, the culture, the behavior, and all of that enshrined within organizational purpose, then the organization is going to lose its positioning in society. It's going to lose its positioning in the market. So it's this focus on the soft stuff, these intangibles, which are going to mark out the transformational thinking, the transformational governance, which these transformational boards need to lead. And that is the third generation of governance, from compliance through business enabling, business facilitation, to the transformational leadership based on purpose, vision, mission, culture, values, and behaviors. And those are the issues that we would like to discuss during the rest of this session today. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the organizers of this summit for building an excellent program on this important topic. I have been asked to talk about how business schools are shaping the future of governance through business education. So first, let me define what business schools are good at. So the first point is there's deep research by faculty based on theoretical models and large troves of data. These studies are published in peer-reviewed journals that are usually replicated by other faculty members and PhD students. Often, these studies are way ahead of what practitioners in the field, namely executives or regulators, have focused on. And the results of these studies and costs of these problems are often felt in future economic crises. The finding of these studies lead to academic tenure, prestige, career advancement, and in the best case, one gets the Nobel Prize. In other words, the interests of the faculty member and that of advancing the science of corporate governance is aligned. So I want to emphasize there is a science of corporate governance. The second is case studies. Many times, faculty members write case studies where students can learn the concepts of governance using the Socratic method. These case studies are also available from Harvard Business School, Darden School of Business at the University of Virginia, etc., or directly from the individual faculty. Third, business schools are good at teaching and often teach the lessons learned from the collective science of good governance to undergraduate, MBA, and PhD students based on the appropriate level of study. Finally, the science of good governance educates governance policy and regulators. So these 4 points are what good governance is through business education. So what historically has been the science of good governance? So a little background. The science of good governance is based on twin concepts of moral hazard and asymmetric information. Moral hazard is just the concept that was first introduced by Bengt Holmstrom at MIT, and for which he won the Nobel Prize. It just shows how can contracts change the behavior of agent when you can't observe the behavior of agents. So in good governance framework, how do contracts change the behavior of the top management team, given that the board of directors and or shareholders don't know exactly what managers or the top management do? The second concept is asymmetric information, which was won by Akerlof, who won the Nobel Prize for it. And it's basically saying if you have good practices, how does good managers join good firms? So you sort of want the bad managers to die out with the bad firms. Now, long before the corporate governance scandals in the early 2000s of Enron, WorldCom, and Tyco, there were a number of studies, and they were started by two Columbia professors, Burley and Means, in 1932, showing that there was a problem of diffuse shareholder ownership. We mean diffuse in the context that there were a lot of small shareholders and they had neither the means nor the time to completely monitor managers' actions. This concept was also done in the 1970s, which showed that managers were not maximizing shareholder value. And one prominent study was by Jensen and Meckling in 1976. Now, given this outcrop in the 70s and early 80s, one mechanism of getting managers disciplined was debt. And corporate debt led to the creation of the leverage buyout, wherein managers who were bad were replaced by corporate raiders like Carl Icahn, T. Boone Pickens, KKR, wherein the company was loaded up on high levels of debt, which paid off existing shareholders at a premium, and the debt had to be serviced by the new management team. Okay. So there are other corporate governance mechanisms other than debt. Some examples are house set pay for CEOs and other top executives, and option backdating. So let me just say, when you say house set pay for CEOs and other top executives, what is important is not pay levels, but pay performance sensitivity. So executives, top management benefit only when shareholders do well. And we want them, shareholders, to do well in the long term. So you should have a long-term vesting schedule for options and stock. Now, there was also a study on option backdating. Options are derivatives that go up in value when the stock price rises. And there was a study by Eric Lee of Iowa that showed that 29.2% of companies have used backdated options, and 13.6% of options granted were backdated or manipulated. Okay. Given the study, one of the companies was Apple. So it's not like these things only happen in badly managed companies. So they had to pay fines and damages to shareholders. The third mechanism is the board of directors. So do more outsiders on the board help? And we find, yes, you don't want a director to be on a busy board, which is basically sitting on too many boards. And you want them to be long-term value-based and not have staggered boards. Staggered boards are, if you want to take over a company, you shouldn't have to wait 3 meetings. That means, let's say the board is 9 board members, and every 3 years, 3 come up, then, or every 2 years, 3 come up for reappointment. That means anyone who wants to take over the board has to spend 6 years. The other mechanisms that we have studied is takeovers, or the market for corporate control. And we find that targets earn high returns over the market on announcement of a deal, but many acquiring mergers, bidders, stock do not do well. So they can in fact earn many times negative returns. Other mechanisms that have been studied is disclosure policy. The makeup of the audit committee should include only those directors who have an accounting background. Also, how they pick accruals. Accruals is an accounting item that makes accounting statements equal to cash flows, and there's a discretionary part there. And finally, you don't want any booking of expenses immediately. You want booking of expenses immediately instead of counting it as capital expenditure. Finally, there's shareholder voting, which has been started based on a lot of research, where they vote on director appointments and top management pay. More recently, there's been the advent of activist investors like Bill Ackman of Pershing Square, who took over Chipotle, Lowe's, etc., and Nelson Peltz of Trian Fund Management, who took over Snapple, Heinz, etc. And basically, they take over certain companies and create further value for shareholders. So they have to disclose this when their ownership level is 5% over the market. So all these mechanisms, which have been studied and actually used by executives or activists, investors, regulators, is all about maximizing shareholder value and or debt holder value. However, there have been some new developments in the science of good governance. What about other stakeholders? The first is employees. Some evidence that gains to shareholders and debt holders come from losses to employees' wages. Okay. So, other thing that has been studied is having women or diversity based on race in top management or on boards of directors makes the value of the company higher. That's what the data tells us. Then the final innovation that is coming about is climate. Now, we all know that climate is a classic case of what in economics we call an externality. Okay, why is coal cheap? Because it does not as a source of energy, because all those who use or produce coal do not pay for the price of pollution. For a long time, academic economists have said a carbon tax is the best way to do it, but it seems that this is politically impossible, both within the US and in other countries. So recently, a small activist hedge fund called Engine Number One got 3 directors on the board of ExxonMobil so that ExxonMobil can meet the goals of decarbonization by 2050. However, note that Engine Number One owned only 0.02% of Exxon, but they convinced large shareholders like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and the California and New York state pension funds that this was right. So, in doing it, it was motivated by a paper, academic paper by Oliver Hart and Luigi Zingales of Harvard and Chicago, respectively, saying Milton Friedman's sole focus on maximizing shareholder value is wrong. After all, Hart and Zingales argue, all shareholders are members of society with ethical and social concerns. And if you aggregate all shareholders, one should maximize shareholder welfare and not shareholder value. This has given rise to ESG investing, which is environmental, social, and governance factors. And 1/3 of US assets under management of about 13 trillion, according to the SIF Foundation in 2020, considers this ESG factors. So it's in the interest of companies to have good environmental, social, and governance factors. So we can see that through data and research and teaching, business schools educate their students and practicing executives on good governance that is evidence-based. Business schools also help regulators and policymakers in creating the rules and the law to focus on the right governance mechanisms. We hope that business schools will continue playing this role in the future as business and society evolve. Thank you.